Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see everyone's digital faces out there. So I am reporting to you. Ignore my background here. I'm not really at Busch Stadium, home of the Cardinals, but I'm instead at my home reporting to you digitally. I am a professional tour guide for the Cardinals, and I've worked with them since 2014. And as many of you, if you're baseball fans, know, along with many things going on in the world today, the baseball season has been postponed indefinitely. And actually, today, April 2nd, was supposed to be the Cardinals' home opener at Busch Stadium. So we thought, what is the next best thing? If we can't celebrate the Cardinals' home opener, we'll bring the Cardinals a little bit to you. Now, I, along with my fellow staff of tour guides at the stadium, give stadium tours to over 50,000 guests every single year. And we give tours year-round, whether it's the middle of July or the middle of January. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to highlight some of the things we talk about on that tour, some of the fun facts and the history. So what I want you to know is if you're not particularly a baseball fan, don't worry about that, because in these 50,000 people we see every year, we have people who run the gamut. We have people from all over the world, people who are really big baseball fans, people who have never seen a baseball before in their lives and don't know how the game works. So don't worry, we're not going to be talking about a lot of stats and things like that. We're going to talk about some interesting little bits of history that at least I find interesting, and hopefully you will too, that you can share with all your friends and family once baseball season starts. So this is my first time doing a sort of digital stadium tour, but we're going to see how it works, and we're going to be in on this together. So with that, we are going to get started, and our journey starts back in the year 1892. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on around the world in 1892. President Grover Cleveland just got elected to his second presidential term that year. That's also the year that Lizzie Borden infamously took an axe to her parents. That's the year that Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Ballet debuts. And it is, most importantly, the year when the St. Louis Cardinals officially come into existence. So that means, if you're doing the math, that this year, once our season gets started, means that we'll be in the midst of our 128th season of baseball played entirely in the city of St. Louis, which we are very proud and honored by. Now, this picture here is from one of the rooms of our stadium, Busch Stadium in downtown St. Louis. It's from a room called the Redbird Club. Now, the Redbird Club has the distinction of being the largest indoor club of any Major League Baseball stadium in history. This room can accommodate you and 3,000 of your closest friends. But the most exciting thing about this room is the one-of-a-kind wallpaper that tells the illustrated history of the St. Louis Cardinals using, appropriately, baseball cards. Maybe many of you collected or still do collect baseball cards. A wonderful item to have in your collection. Now, looking at these baseball cards of Cardinals history, chances are you don't see very many familiar faces. There's no Yadier Molina, there's no Mark McGwire, no Ozzie Smith, no Lou Brock on this wall. They're all too young. Most of these cards you're looking at come from the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. Looking at them, you'll notice that they're missing some important things. First thing you'll notice is that their jerseys don't have numbers on them. In fact, the Cardinals have the distinction of being the first National League team to ever introduce numbers on their jerseys. And that was in 1923, 1924, the numbers mysteriously disappear again. Why is that? Well, back in the 1920s, there was only one other group of people who wore numbers on their shirts, that being people in prison. And we got made fun of a lot for that. And we kind of got our feelings hurt that people were calling the Cardinals jailbirds. So we only had the numbers on our jersey for 1 year. And then many years passed until all of baseball jumped on the bandwagon and added numbers to their jerseys. Going further into the look of the Cardinals, one thing you also do not notice in these pictures There's no iconic bird on the bat logo that the Cardinals have become well known for. And that's because we were not always known as the Cardinals. In fact, we've had a bit of an identity crisis in the first decade of our history. Back when we first came into existence, the team that you know today as the St. Louis Cardinals were in fact the St. Louis Brown Stockings. And we looked a little bit like this, so called because of the color of our brown socks that were part of our uniform. We eventually realized that brown stockings was a bit of a mouthful to say, so we changed our name from St. Louis Brown Stockings to simply the St. Louis Browns. Then a few years after that, we decided we didn't like that so much, so we rename ourselves. This time we name ourselves after a popular brand of cigar. We become the St. Louis Perfectos in 1899. Yeah, that name is a bit of a bit of an oddball one. But when we become the St. Louis Perfectos, we get a brand new uniform. We ditch that brown uniform that you're seeing right there for one that's a little bit more fetching. This one in particular, that introduces the red socks, the red belt, the red trim, the red word St. Louis across the front. So one day, the Perfectos are showing off their brand new uniform at our stadium called Sportsman's Park. And there was a woman in the stands who made an offhanded comment. She thought nothing of it. She simply turned to her friend and said, "What a lovely shade of cardinal they're now wearing." And with this one sentence, she changed our entire history. Because though we do not know who this woman was, seated close by to her was a man named Willie McHale. Willie McHale was a sports reporter for the St. Louis Republic newspaper. He heard this comment, thought Cardinals was a really snazzy nickname, and so in his articles in the St. Louis Republic, he began referring to the team as the Cardinals in quotation marks. Well, other sports writers and other fans really liked this nickname and began using it. And the next year, 1900, the team made the decision to officially change our name from the Perfectos to the St. Louis Cardinals. So now you know the true story. We are not named after the bird whatsoever. We're named after the color of that 1899 uniform that you see on screen. So where do the birds eventually come into play? Well, for that, we need to flash forward into the future 22 years from this point. In 1922, our general manager was a guy named Branch Rickey. Now, Branch Rickey may be a familiar name to you if you're a big baseball fan, because Branch Rickey is the guy who signed a little-known baseball player named Jackie Robinson to play for the Brooklyn Dodgers, breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball and forever changing the sport. But Branch Rickey got his start in baseball with the St. Louis Cardinals as our general manager. Now, in 1922, while he was here, he went to a special dinner at Ferguson Presbyterian Church in North St. Louis. Now, at that special dinner, there was a woman named Allie Mae Schmidt, whose job was to create table decorations for the dinner. Well, this dinner took place in February. It was winter. Allie Mae Schmidt is trying to get inspiration for what to do for her decorations, and she looks into her backyard. In her backyard, she had a lilac bush, and in that lilac bush, she saw a few cardinal birds. She thought the red cardinal birds against the freshly fallen snow was a beautiful image, so she decides to make little cardboard cutouts of cardinals. You see them in the lower left-hand corner of her picture there. Those are the actual centerpieces that she created for that dinner. Well, Branch Rickey sees these centerpieces, he falls in love with them, and he says to her, "I want those centerpieces to be my logo starting next year." And he kept his promise. From church basement decorations, we got what would become the most recognizable logo in sports today, and that is what that original 1922 logo looked like. A little bit more primitive than we're used to seeing today. It had the black bat and the more cartoony-looking cardinal birds with their tails up. Now, our logo has evolved and changed over the years. The first change from that point came about 5 years later. So in 1926, the Cardinals win their first World Series championship against the very dreaded New York Yankees. Now, they had people like Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth on this team. We were not favored to win. We were very much the underdogs, but we ended up winning. And we were very excited about that. So we decided the year after, in 1927, we were going to mark the fact that we were the newly branded world champions. And we got a new logo that surrounded the cardinal and the word world champions. Now, this was not a small logo. It took up the entire chest. And as you can imagine, this is the first time anything like this had been done. And other baseball teams were not super thrilled with us being so braggadocious. In fact, our team was getting hit by a lot of stray baseballs thrown by pitchers. And eventually the commissioner of baseball said, you got to take that logo off, and no team can ever be allowed to do something like that again. So in 1927, we had that logo. We had to take it off, and there wouldn't be another World Series champion logo on a uniform until 2003. In 2003, the Miami Marlins win the World Series, and they put a small patch that says World Champions. Now, as opposed to this one that you're seeing that took up the full chest, nowadays teams are only allowed to have a small patch on their sleeve. And over the years, the logo morphed and changed. Sometimes the cardinal bird got clothing, like this guy who's wearing a hat. Sometimes they got opposable thumbs, like Slugger Bird swinging a baseball bat here. But in the 1990s, we got our current ownership team, and they requested a logo that was more ornithologically correct, which is just a fancy way to say that the logo we enjoy today look just like the birds in your backyard, look more realistic. So now you know the true story from a woman inspired by seeing birds in a bush. Now you can see the birds at Busch Stadium. Terrible joke, I know. All right, so we love this logo. This picture is taken on one of our student tours at the stadium. That man you're seeing in the center is Paul Goldschmidt. Last year when he signed his contract with us, he actually popped out and surprised one of our school groups. And you can see by those smiles how excited those kids were to see him. But you'll notice behind them, they have a brick wall that has little carvings of our different logos over history. And these carvings are actually hidden throughout the stadium, like little Easter eggs to find. So if you're ever in person at the stadium, keep an eye out and see if you can ever see any of these cardinal birds. If you watch the team on TV, right behind the backstop, you'll see they're even hidden there. So it's a fun little thing to keep an eye out for. All right, so the Cardinals, obviously our most famous baseball team, but the Cardinals were not St. Louis's only baseball team. For 50 years, our town was just like Chicago or New York City are today. We had two teams. We had the National League Cardinals and we had the American League St. Louis Browns. Now, this is not to be confused for the small period of time that the Cardinals were known as the Browns. This team came a little bit later. They came in 1902, and they were with us for 52 seasons. Now, the St. Louis Browns were famous, not for being good, but for being really, really bad. Awful. They had 52 seasons of baseball in St. Louis. They only had 12 seasons where they won more games than they lost. So they had to find a way to get fans into the stands. And that's where their owner came into play. His name was Bill Veeck. That's a picture of him stuffing his face with a hot dog. Now, Bill Veeck was known for being the P.T. Barnum of Major League Baseball. He was very much a showman. He lost his right leg in World War II. He had a wooden leg, and he loved coming up with quirky little ideas to get people into the stadium. One of those ideas was what he called Grandstand Manager's Day. Here we have a picture of that. So someone from the team would hold up a big billboard asking the crowd what the team should do. Here they're asking if they should take out a pitcher or if they should steal second base. They would have all kinds of different questions like this, and the crowd, as you would see there, would be provided with a variety of billboards that would say yes or no, and the crowd would vote on what to do, and then the team would have to do what the crowd said. Perhaps his most famous stunt, however, was using a man named Eddie Gaedel to stand up to the plate. Now, Eddie Gaedel was a 27-year-old guy, and he was 3 foot 7 inches tall. He was a little person. So Bill Veeck said, I'm going to sign this little guy to a one-day contract with the Browns, and everyone will want to come to the stadium to see this little guy take the plate. He, after all, had an impossible strike zone, and Eddie Goodell did. For one inning, he had one at-bat, and they walked him, as you can imagine. Now, when they brought Eddie Goodell on for that one day, they needed to find a uniform that would fit him. So what they did is they took the uniform from the Bat Boy and they put the number 1/8 on the back of it. In that picture on the left, you can see a picture of Eddie Goodell with his 1/8 uniform on. This uniform is actually on display today at the St. Louis Cardinals Hall of Fame and Museum. Now, the Bat Boy they took this uniform from is the young man in the picture to the right, handing a bat to Babe Ruth. Now, that Bat Boy's name was Bill DeWitt Jr. Bill DeWitt Jr. grew up, and today he's the owner of the St. Louis Cardinals. So it's kind of interesting to see that the Bat Boy for the St. Louis Browns eventually became the owner of the St. Louis Cardinals. Now, though the Browns were really, really bad, one year they got lucky. In 1944, the St. Louis Browns made it all the way to the World Series, where as fate would have it, so did the St. Louis Cardinals. 1944 was an all St. Louis World Series, played entirely in the one ballpark that both teams shared, Sportsman's Park. So it is the only time in baseball history where a World Series has taken place in only one stadium. Now, the Cardinals ultimately won this World Series, but we're very honored to have that as a part of St. Louis history. Now, the Browns are not in St. Louis today. In the early 1950s, they realized that they could not compete with the popularity of the St. Louis Cardinals. So they decided to pack up and they moved away to become the Baltimore Orioles that we know today. Now, the ironic thing and the sad thing is that today, April 2nd, our home opener at Busch Stadium was supposed to be against the Baltimore Orioles. So it would have been a nice symbolic rematch between the Cardinals and their old hometown rivals, the Browns. But we'll get that game in at some point. All right. So we talked a little bit about the teams that have called St. Louis home. Let's talk about the stadiums that those teams have called home. So we've been around for 128 years. Busch Stadium is not 128 years old. Our first stadium was an all-wood stadium that eventually would be renamed Busch Stadium. But if you want to sound like a true local, you'll refer to that ballpark by its original name, Sportsman's Park. Sportsman's Park was located in North St. Louis City. As I said, it was made entirely of wood. It sat about 30,000 people, and it was a beautifully old-fashioned ballpark. One way that you can tell they were super old-fashioned was the way that they cut their grass. Now, today at the stadium, we have multi-million-dollar equipment that we spend manicuring our lawn so that it looks perfect. Back in Sportsman's Park, to cut the grass, they used a herd of goats that were left out after every game. The goats would free roam the field, and they would eat it, and that's how we trimmed the grass and fertilized it at the same time, if you catch my drift. So Sportsman's Park we played in until 1966. So where does the name change come? When does it become from Sportsman's Park to Busch Stadium? Well, for that, we need to delve a little bit deeper into that history. So the Browns pack up and they move to Baltimore to Baltimore to become the Orioles. At that same time, our owner for the Cardinals was a guy named Fred Sy. Now, Fred Sy in real life was a tax attorney. It's tax month. He was a tax attorney. But Fred Sy had to go to jail. What was his crime? Not paying his taxes. So when Fred Sy went to jail, he had to put the team up for sale. And the cities of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Houston, Texas, put in really big bids to buy the team to bring them to their cities. So all of a sudden, we go from having 2 baseball teams to being in danger of having 0 baseball teams. So St. Louis city officials went down the street to Anheuser-Busch Brewery to talk to this man, August A. Busch Jr., the president of Anheuser-Busch. No doubt you know the beautiful Clydesdales that are the icon of Anheuser-Busch. Those were his horses that he came up with. But people went to Mr. Busch and said, Mr. Busch, you've got some deep pockets. How about you buy the Cardinals and keep them in St. Louis? To which he promptly said no, because he said, I'm not a sports guy. I like brewing beer. That's what I do. Luckily for us, someone very close to him said, Augie, think about it. If you buy this team, picture that there are going to be 30,000 fans on a hot St. Louis summer day looking for something cold to drink. He quickly realized he could have the largest open-air tavern in St. Louis. So he whips out his checkbook and for $3.85 million buys the team and the stadium. And he says, I'm going to rename it after my signature product, Budweiser Stadium. Well, Major League Baseball stepped in and said, Mr. Busch, you can't name a stadium after a beer. So he said, well, that stinks. But he comes up with the idea to name the stadium after his family. So he names it Busch Stadium after his family. Now, ironically, the next year, his brewery comes up with a new product. And that new product is going to need a name. And he has the perfect one, Busch Bavarian beer. So in the end, Mr. Busch gets his way. So a few years after he buys Sportsman's Park and the team, he builds a new stadium known as Busch Memorial Stadium. Pictured here is a beautiful example of mid-century modern architecture, and it had the 96 arches around the top that mimicked the iconic Gateway Arch on the riverfront. This stadium sat 60,000 people, and it was a multi-purpose civic center. Yes, we had baseball. We also had football. We had hot air balloon launches, circuses, monster truck shows. The Beatles played their only St. Louis-based concert in that stadium. So it was full of really great memories. So we played there until 2005. And in 2006, we opened our current stadium, Busch Stadium 3. Now, you can notice it looks pretty retro. It is a retro-style stadium built of all brick and steel with all those arch details, so that it would mimic the old-fashioned ballparks of the 1910s and the 1920s. Now, the interesting thing is that a third of the area that is our current ballpark was occupied by Busch Memorial Stadium. So we had to wait for the team to finish up their final season in 2005 at this stadium before we could finish construction on this one. And by the time we knocked Busch Memorial Stadium down, we only had 100 days exactly with which to build a third of this stadium. So a third of that stadium was completed in 100 days' time, in time for us to call that site Home Sweet Home April 10th of 2006. Now, we're very big about our history and loving our past here in St. Louis. Across the street from this stadium is an entertainment complex known as Ballpark Village. It was built on top of what was the site of our second stadium. All these people in this picture are gathered on a patio designed to look like a baseball diamond. And that little patio is built exactly on top of the site that was the infield, the baseball diamond, for our second stadium. So if you're ever in town, stop by and you can stand exactly where home plate was for 40 years of great baseball memories at that stadium. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of our favorite players. Now, we are very lucky to have many players in our history that could be considered heroes. The cherry on top of the cake is this guy, number 6, Stan the Man Musial. From Denora, Pennsylvania, he played all 20 years of his major league career with the Cardinals, and he was an incredible ball player. In this picture, you get a bird's eye view of an area of our stadium called Stan Musial Plaza. Now, that plaza is made up of 3,630 bricks. Now, that is not a random number. That is actually the same number of hits he had in his 20-year career, 3,630. He's still ranked number 4 in terms of all-time career hits to this day. Even more impressive than hitting that large number of hits is that he hit exactly half of them, 1,815 in St. Louis, and half of them on the road. Very consistent player. But what's more important than being a great player, he was a terrific human being. He never got ejected from a game. He spent His Christmases visiting kids in hospitals around St. Louis who were scared and couldn't be home. And he never turned down an autograph, ever. If you wanted his autograph, he would make sure you got it, which is why the center of Mutual Plaza in that picture is an autographed baseball. And in 2011, he was presented with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest honor you can get as a civilian in the United States, which gives you an idea of what a wonderful man he was. Now let's talk about numbers. Last season, we hosted 3.48 million fans for our baseball season in 2019. We are the second highest drawing baseball team. We draw more people than the Yankees. We draw more people than the Cubs. The only team that has more people than us show up to the stadium are the Los Angeles Dodgers. And they have a lot more people in their area to come to games. But of those 3.85 million fans who identify as Cardinal fans, a third of them traveled from over 100 miles away to attend a game at our stadium. Why do we have so many fans from around the country? Well, a big part to that is KMOX radio. Now, for a long time, the Cardinals were both the westernmost and southernmost baseball team in the country. And the KMOX radio signal was and is so strong that on a clear night, you can listen to one of our home games in over 40 states and parts of Canada. So for a long time in those big chunks of the country that did not yet have their own baseball team to cheer for, they often followed the team they could listen to consistently on the radio. And for many people, that was the Cardinals. And these people passed that tradition on to their kids and their grandkids, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, we've had many wonderful voices of the Cardinals over the years. Jack Buck, who was the voice of the Cardinals for 4 decades, pictured here welcoming baseball back after an interruption caused by the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He had a famous poem called For America that he read once baseball was back in operation. He taught his skills to his son, Joe Buck, who now has gone big and national, and he announces all kinds of different sports. Yeah, this guy, Harry Carey. Now, most people know that the Chicago Cubs are the Cardinals' biggest rivals. And Harry Carey is most known for being the voice of the Cubs. But many people forget that long before he ever went north to Chicago, Harry Carey was our announcer for the St. Louis Cardinals for 25 years. And certainly a very quirky character. If you ever got a chance to listen to him, you know that. He was not the most accurate announcer, but he certainly was the most fun. And sometimes we feel that way about our current announcer, Mike Shannon, who has the nickname Moon Man. For one day when he was announcing a game out of town, he made an announcement that he wished the folks back home in St. Louis could see this beautiful moon tonight. Well, they can, Mike. It's the moon. They can see it everywhere. But he's a quirky guy, 80 years old, and he sits on this big red exercise ball. So if you ever get a chance to listen to one of our home games, just imagine these bouncing up and down on that big bouncy ball. Now, they get a great view from the broadcast booth. This is the view that they get. Now, we often get questions as to whether we use real or fake grass at the stadium. Though we did use AstroTurf for 20 years at our second stadium, we use real grass at our current stadium. That grass you are looking at there is Kentucky bluegrass. We don't get it from Missouri. If it's Kentucky bluegrass, we obviously get it from Colorado. That grass is shipped in on refrigerated trucks from Aurora, Colorado. Now, Kentucky bluegrass is a very temperamental grass. It doesn't like to be hot. One thing you can guarantee that St. Louis will be in the middle of summer is hot. So that entire field has its own air conditioning system. 14 inches beneath the surface, you have a system of pipes that's sole job is to pump in cool air to cool the roots of the grass. That's when you know you got too much money, when your grass can have an air conditioning system. We often get questions as to how we're able to put the pattern in the grass. We cut our grass every single day 1/4 of an inch, and on the back of our riding lawnmowers, there's a rolling metal pipe that makes the blades of grass lay flat one direction or the other. So it's very similar to if you rub your hand up against carpet, how it kind of changes colors depending what direction the carpet is going. That's exactly what we do here, just on a much larger scale. Now, one patch of grass that is not very fancy is that one directly out in center field splitting the bleachers. It's this area of grass known as the batter's eye. Many people wonder why we don't have seats in that area. Well, back in the early part of the 20th century, every stadium did have seats there. But back in the early 20th century, people also came to the game wearing button-down white dress shirts. Now, remember, this area is directly in the batter's line of vision. And if everyone's wearing white shirts, it becomes very difficult to pick out that white ball against that white backdrop. And some players were getting hit with baseballs and getting hurt. The Cleveland Indians had a player who got hit by a baseball he couldn't see and died as a result of his injuries. So it set the wheels into motion that Major League Baseball made it a rule that every stadium had to get rid of those seats and replace it with a dark, solid background known as the batter's eye. So that is why any stadium you see around the country will have a dark, solid background like this. And it makes a big difference. Here you have a picture of Mike Shannon, that announcer who sits on the big red ball, throwing out the ceremonial first pitch. Look at how easily you can pick up that white ball against that dark background, as opposed to if that ball was in front of all those fans you see in the right of the picture. It becomes a lot more difficult then. All right. So let's finish up real quick by talking about our World Series championships. The Cardinals are 11-time World Series champions. We have the second most World Series championships after our friends, the New York Yankees, who have 27. Now, if you ever have a Yankees fan who gives you a hard time for only having 11 championships, you just throw them this bit of math. The Cardinals have faced the Yankees 5 times in the World Series and have won 3 of them. So just remember, if the Yankees give you a hard time, tell them to stick that in their pipe and smoke it. So we won 11 World Series championships. That means we have how many trophies? We have 4. Why is that? Well, because back in the early days, when you won the World Series, you would not win a trophy. You would get a large flag. I know, contain your enthusiasm. That flag was known as the pennant, which is why winning the World Series is sometimes still referred to as winning the pennant. But in 1967, things changed. In 1967, you had the very first Super Bowl for the National Football League. And football didn't give away a flag. They gave away the beautiful Lombardi trophy. So Major League Baseball said, football's giving away a trophy. Hockey has the Stanley Cup, and we're giving away a flag. We got to keep up with the Joneses a little bit. So in 1967, they create the first ever Commissioner's Trophy. That is what you are seeing right there. And in 1967, the teams who were playing in the World Series were the Boston Red Sox and then the champions, the St. Louis Cardinals, which means that the Cardinals have the first ever World Series trophy ever presented, which, if you're a baseball fan, is a pretty big deal. This trophy is on display in the Champions Club of our stadium, so you can see it anytime you're there. So we won in 1967. We won again in 1982 against the Milwaukee Brewers when they were in the American League. In 2006, we beat the Detroit Tigers and we got this trophy. And remember, our stadium opened in 2006. So that year was very special that we became one of only 3 teams in history that have won the World Series the same year they inaugurated a stadium. The Pittsburgh Pirates have done it, and the New York Yankees have done it twice. And then in 2011, we won our most recent World Series trophy. Notice that the trophy's got a bit of a makeover over time. These older trophies were made by a company called Balfour. They were famous for making class rings, hence they have that giant ring in the center of the trophy. In 2000, however, it's the new millennium, so Major League Baseball is looking to have a more modern-looking trophy. So they went to a new company to make the trophy, a little mom-and-pop jewelry store called Tiffany & Company. They make the trophies today. They weigh about 30 pounds apiece. They're worth about $64,000. And if you've ever purchased anything from Tiffany, you know it comes in a Tiffany blue box. Well, when the World Series trophies are delivered, they come delivered in a Tiffany blue box. Now, in 2011, one final thing before I let you guys go today, is we had a very important event happen. In 2011, when we were in the postseason, working our way to the World Series, we were playing against the Philadelphia Phillies, and we were losing until all of a sudden, a squirrel hopped across the top of home plate. You see him in the little red circle at the bottom of this picture. While our man Skip Schumacher was up at bat, the squirrel comes across home plate, and we go from losing that game to winning that game. So this squirrel became dubbed the Rally Squirrel, and he sort of became our de facto mascot for the rest of the season. And people went crazy over him. People started bringing little squirrel dolls to the stadium. They bought Rally Squirrel t-shirts. He has his own Facebook page. He was on TV. So when we ultimately won that World Series, it seemed only appropriate that we hid the Rally Squirrel in the design of the ring. This is that ring. It features 103 diamonds, 50 rubies, is worth about $40,000. And right beneath that ruby red STL insignia, you can see the squirrel hopping across the top of home plate. It was an incredible moment, a quirky moment, and I think of no better way to end this presentation than with that. So I thank you so much. Eventually, the baseball season will start, and hopefully we'll have another vision of the Rally Squirrel, because the 11-time World Series champion Cardinals would like to become the 12-time World Series champion St. Louis Cardinals. So I thank you so much for your attention. Whether you're a root for another team, root for the Cardinals, or don't give a hoot about baseball, I hope you've found an interesting story and something to enlighten your day. And I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy. And let's play ball.